That's how you know the recording's in progress. Cool. Thanks y'all for joining. Super excited. I feel like Maya. Do you prefer to be called Maya or Diamond D?
Yeah, maybe call me Maya.
Maya. Cool. Um, yeah, thank you so much for putting your hand up to be part of the June series of Mars Day Wushu. I'm gonna give a little spiel about what Mars Day Wushu is about and what it has been about. And it's gonna go like this. So basically, about a year and maybe a few months ago, I started a container on Tuesdays, which is also like Tuesday, according to like lineages of the northern part of the world. And yeah, I'd say that Tua is like a reasonable approximation of like the planetary energy of Mars. In the English speaking world, we just call it Tuesday. But, like Mars Day for me, archetypically is associated with like action. I think it's associated with the root chakra. Um, Sometimes it's associated with violence. And then the other part of Mars Day, wushu, like wushu, sounds like something you might eat at like a fake Japanese restaurant. But it kind of refers to like, an arena or a container for martial art, right? And I think that many of those early sessions or early containers of Mars Day Wushu were quite martial in the sense that A, like martial usually means violent to people. B, violence to me energetically often doesn't show up in the material realm. Ideally, it doesn't, I would say. So we can keep the earth space-time fabric as lovely as possible. But I think that there was a recognition that I tried to enculturate in that container that sometimes if you want the least violence possible, either materially or immaterially, we need to use violence to reduce violence. I had a friend named Ree who passed away very sadly, rest in peace, who used to have this t-shirt which said, "Fighting for peace is like fucking for virginity." And it seemed very clever at the time. And it kind of like enculturated in me this like binary that like non-violence cannot be achieved through violence. And I think it's like to a great extent fairly true, right? So most of us have probably heard of the idea of Pax Romana. I think most of us are probably aware of how deeply revered Ares or Mars was by the people of Rome, or the rulers of Rome and the people of Rome. And Pax is about peace, but I feel like most of us could probably see how, in a sense, some peace was achieved, but this often came at like a high cost of blood and violence. And then a lot of people would say Pax Americana is like the extension of Pax Romana. I would mostly agree with them. And I feel like we're all hopefully familiar with the violence that takes place to Americans and non-Americans in order to protect the peace, which in some ways is still very violent, immaterially and materially. But I digress as I always do, and maybe you can help me work on parts that cause me to digress, Maya. But I would say that Mars Day Wushu in its current incarnation is about conversation as a martial art. And I would say that for me, martial art is anything which relates to like the energies exchanged between separate selves, trying to hit like admit as people try to enter the waiting room while I digress wildly. I feel like martial art will often show up as non-violent, and hopefully even if we have to be like violent to what I would call demons, or like I think some people would call egregores or thought forms, in order to allow peace to arise between each of the constituent cells in ourself and between each of the constituent cells in the body of Earth, the body of humanity. Hopefully it can be joyful and beautiful. And that's the end of my spiel. And now I guess I'll just like shut up and let you start doing some energy work on me. Thank you.
And I actually start by explaining some of what I might be doing.
Sweet.
And like, yeah, so I do a bit different stuff than most of the people who have been working on these calls. So most of my work is inspired by internal family systems, or IFS, and somatic experiencing, which is a form of trauma therapy, which is basically energy work, but dressed as therapy. So it's fairly acceptable for Western people, but it's also quite influenced by shamanism. And I also use hypnosis, which I feel is very underused, considering it was basically the first form of psychotherapy in the West. And also I do also stuff like what could be called like direct energy work, but I guess that's a bit harder to demonstrate because, yeah, it just happens somewhere. So that's where I was thinking that I might demonstrate something that's that's more visible or audible. And we talked about doing hypnosis, though I do wonder, because you have that little sweet creature over there, and it might distract you from trance states, especially because I suspect that you being in a trance state might cause interesting effects for that creature as well.
Oh, I can close the door. I think I'll close the door if that's cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
She might still end up in a trance, right? Because these things can be non-local, but
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm also a little bit nervous because I do IFS and SE type work most days, but I last did hypnosis last year when I was in Sofia, and it went quite well, but it's been a while, so I feel like, oh, I might be a little rusty, but let's see what happens. So are you ready to start?
yeah, I think so. Yeah, let's go.
Okay. Then you might actually open your eyes and take a look. You can just choose a spot on the wall and like an eye level or a bit above it, not not necessarily a weird spot, just like rest your eyes somewhere on there.
Is it okay if my head's turning?
I think it might be better if you just keep it fairly straight.
Okay. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. And you can just keep looking at that spot on the wall, and it's okay if your eyes get a little bit tired because they can rest soon. And you can keep focusing on that spot. And you can also feel your breath as it enters your nostrils. And you can hear my voice as you keep looking at that spot and as you keep feeling your breath. And your eyes can get a little bit tired and very relaxed, and you can just keep staring at that spot, or you can let your eyes rest as well if that feels better to you, while also focusing on your breath and hearing my words. And your eyes can get so pleasantly relaxed, all your eye muscles so very relaxed that Even if you try to open your eyes, you would find you can no longer open them. And you can let the relaxation spread to your whole face. It can get stronger as it spreads to your head. The relaxation can spread down your neck to your back and chest, can spread to your belly and lower back and down your arms, still growing in intensity. You can let your body relax completely as the relaxation keeps spreading down your pelvis and legs, all the way down your legs, all the way into your toes, so that your whole body can be very relaxed. And as your body relaxes, your mind can relax even more. As your mind relaxes, your body can relax even deeper. All muscles in your body can relax and let go of any tension. And every word of mine that you hear can take you a little bit deeper into this pleasant state of relaxation. And if there are any noises in your surroundings, they can also just take you a bit deeper and direct your attention back to my words. How are you feeling?
I feel good. I don't think I've ever been hypnotized before. I do go into like trance states pretty easily, and yeah, it feels pretty familiar.
Yeah. Are there any particular parts that you would like to work on?
So many parts. Well, I definitely feel something related to my solar plexus, which I would say feels corded to something which is like to the right of my abdomen, and also to my root. And I feel like it relates to fighting for survival. Was that a good description?
Yeah. Does that part have anything you would like to say verbally about the fighting for survival?
Hmm. It says it's me.
Mm. Would you let the part know that it's actually not you but just a part of you.
Mm. Mhm.
How does it react to that?
Feels like it changes color. Before it felt like it was kind of like yellow with like some orange and red. And then I feel like there's something which feels like it's next to it slash underneath it, which is sort of like lavender and indigo.
Does the part feel like it has an age?
Mm, which one?
The one that's fighting for survival.
Mm, I would say it feels like it's about 13.
What happens if you let this part know your current age?
I have to think about how old I am first, because it's been a long time since someone asked me for my ID. I feel like something in my roots like twitches. And then thoughts arise relating to like where I should be at my age.
That sounds like it might be a different part. So you
Mhm,
could try asking if this part would be willing to step aside for a bit.
mhm. I'm just like exercising it because it was not. So like I feel like the first part we started talking about, it's a little more present now, a little more vivid, um, a little more yellow, a little larger.
How does the fighting for survival part feel about hearing your current age?
Mm. Mm. There was like another part that I had to clear. I mean, I'm clearing parts in my left leg now, which feel like they relate to like feeling a pressure to have been at a certain point. And then there is like mental chatter arising to the effect of like, well, I was at that point um already, and etc. etc. It wasn't working. So like, yeah, there's like parts of the left side of my body which are kind of like twitching, which I would kind of associate with like some kind of release. And I feel like that blue and lavender part is like expanding into like my left side, let's say. So then if I go back to the fighting for survival part and like again like remind it how old I am and time, I feel like my crown's very active and I'm clearing things from my root. I would say like my field of like inner vision is becoming more golden, and my root feels expanded. And it's almost like it's returning like energy to my solar plexus. And I'm just gonna like let that happen for a while. Is it okay if I move and like make sounds?
Sure.
Okay. Я такой, что я сильно самоцентрированный. Не дает даром, что каве, что я сара тут конечно не снова я в таком как Ora tätä koronatypisteemeltä kotiin tarvita umani äänestäjän täällä kapanemmassa kategorista ja kategorita kanssa kainen äänestäjän mutta forminen ai support kotiin kainen kadis stillliken ja me maalise kiene sorta ääkien shäden kotiin vuorotettiin tässä.
What would happen if you didn't have to fight for survival?
Just like clearing things that, well, it's kind of, I would say it's like hard for me to describe in some ways, but things are coming up and they feel like valid responses to your question. But I would say like my vaster self is like these are just projections. And I'm just like clearing the things which are causing those projections, waiting to be able to answer you straight. I'd say like some of the things that came up would be like, I would fight for fun, or I would fight for others to not have to fight for survival. I really want to give you a more straight answer to your question. I promise. I'm just Just like clearing some stuff. An insha oranede que te somos celebration. Padnie kommer väldigt stora att sikta till första. Niem sare to komidisch damit. Sienisch. Не каним это пекарем что они на катастрофе. Jag kan in i månskärn, en se omvärlden till både och här till på människa. Det som det större. I feel like I'm clearing a lot of parts which are like wanting to do things properly or like according to like your instructions. I would say they mostly like live in my like the connection between my roots and my sacrum.
What would happen if you didn't do stuff right?
Nothing like bad, I think. It's not like I'm in any physical danger. I will say that what I'm seeing now is how much these behavioral programs are informed by like physical abuse. And I feel like I'm kind of I'm in this interesting space where, you know, often I'll say that like it's not appropriate for us to like release karma. And I'm just gonna use the word karma. Release karma like all at once. And that sometimes we kind of have to live out our karma in order to resolve more karma. Or just to have like experience, right? And so as I resolve karma, I feel like a lot of stuff I'm not saying or don't feel called to say. And then some stuff I'm saying, like the stuff I'm saying now, and then that helps me to like clear more things. I'll say that like there have been things that other people have talked about remembering from my childhood that I've been able to remember conceptually without necessarily like vividly remembering the experience of them happening. And I feel like I'm more able to remember some of those experiences now.
If you want to, you can also remind these parts of your current age and that this physical abuse that you have experienced in the past is no longer happening. what's happening right now.
Mm. I'm seeing like the face of the person with whom I was having these experiences with, except they're a little younger. They're like my age now. Well, I think you get what I mean. They're the age that they were when they were the same age that I am now. And my brain is trying to like, understand what what age I would have been when they were that age. And I'm clearing that stuff. I feel like there are like, you know, oh, mm, part of me would characterize them as like my vaster self, and then um that like is just allowing me to clear things without speaking them. And then there are like little parts which are like, well, are you just like doing that because it aligns with like the process or like what you believe in? I'm trying to, well, I'm clearing them too. And I guess what occurs to me is that it's difficult in some ways to say things without thinking them, which is also an accumulation of karma, right? And I would say like karma, which doesn't necessarily need to be resolved because it's good to be able to talk appropriately. And I'd say that there are parts of me that want to return to what you had asked me before, but they're sort of like veiled to me right now. So I'll just be silent and wait for the next thing. The next thing that I can't avoid, or, I cannot resist, or I feel moved to do or say. I feel like saying that there have been many releases in my throat, which I feel are related to the expansion of energy in my sacral. And I feel like whether it's apart or not, it feels aligned for it to expand. And I don't feel that the fighting for survival part is really there, although I would welcome your read of whether it feels like it's there or the read of anybody else. Um,
Yeah, I feel like the fighting for survival is still there.
mhm. I can definitely feel like tension in my roots, which
Yeah. It feels to me like it doesn't want to let go. But maybe it doesn't want to let go because it feels if it lets go, it won't survive. Would it be possible to survive without fighting for survival?
hmm, I feel like it's possible to survive without the feeling of like fighting. I think it can be effortless, even though it requires doing. But yeah, for sure. At least for me. Maybe not for everybody, maybe not for some of my ancestors.
How does it feel to survive without having to fight?
Uh, it feels like making music or dancing, not like, mm, I'd say it feels like dancing, like without caring what you look like or caring if you have to like avoid bumping into people or making the wrong moves or anything like that.
Are you able to expand that careless feeling into your whole field?
Mm, I have to like clear some space for it. Let's say like the space I have to clear for it is like behind me. Feel like it's behind and below me. And as I'm clearing space for it and I'm allowing just awareness, I think like carelessness is like a characteristic of the awareness, but it's not necessarily defining of that awareness. At first, I would say what felt like it was coming up for me was like pre-human, like say, like aquatic ancestry, or like microbial ancestry. And then there is like a backdrop of like nothingness.
Does the nothingness feel safe or unsafe?
Um, I'd say it feels intermittently safe, and then there's stuff that's coming up that makes it feel unsafe, which I'm working with. And then sort of like a falling sinusoid where more of it feels safe for longer and it feels safer. And I guess like what comes up for me in these like glimpses of nothingness that feels safer is that it's like darkness before light. And it's something that I have experienced before. And like experience in my day to day, which is accessible in some contexts and not accessible in other contexts. And I guess like what's coming up for me is that like in these experiences which I was unable to like vividly re-experience or remember, I experienced something which felt similar in a negative way. And so it's almost like aspects of my comfort with that feeling in contexts which resemble those contexts.
Would
Almost
it,
became like blank, sorry, became like blank slates for like thought, thoughts or, like self-concept to explain why I have to have some ideas instead of just feeling nothing or feeling safe in nothingness. Go on.
Yeah, I wonder if it would be possible for you to feel both safe nothingness and the unsafe types of nothingness at the same time.
Mm, yeah, I think that in some ways I am like when I say I feel like tension in my body, or I feel like something is coming up in my body, like some kind of energy. It's like there are aspects of my body which are also like self-recognizing or self-conceptualizing, which can feel parts which are preconceptual, which feel safe, and then there are parts which are like preconceptual, which don't feel safe, which is like what I'm, like calling tension. So in that sense, I feel like they coexist in my awareness. And then generally speaking, and right now, I would say that the parts that feel safe, both conceptual and preconceptual, but I would say like 95 or 96% preconceptual, can kind of like, I'll say in my lineages, like eat the parts which are not safe. But I feel like it correlates to what other people call I would say that like other people might call them like love the parts. And then what kind of like arises as something that feels like a reconciliation of the way these different lineages speak about this process is that those parts are being harmonized. But I would say in a sense that like 95% of the time I would tend to call this like exorcism or eating or harmonizing. And maybe 5% of the time I would say I'll call it like offering love or kindness or grace. And I feel like in some ways these parts relate to, I would say the resolution of these parts relates to increased flexibility in using whatever words, if words are needed, in using whatever words are more appropriate for whatever context I'm in that requires words. And I would say like the gnosis I have is that like rather than saying gratitude or like grace or love or kindness or compassion or metta, like 5% of the time in the context that I will be using words that remain in my lifetime, it probably is more appropriate or aligned to use these words relating to love and kindness. Maybe much more than 5% of the time. um, I feel like I'm getting something like 45% of the time or 46% of the time. But it was pretty funny to see that number vacillate between like 6% of the time and 96% of the time based on whatever parts were being like purged and what they were sort of speaking into my upper chakras, or my self-conceptualizing of self-awareness.
Are you still able to feel the carelessness and effortlessness of being able to survive without the fight?
Yeah, I'd say that like the extent to which I've felt that has kind of like fluctuated. But I feel like, again, overall, it's sort of like taking up more space in my awareness with each of those fluctuations. I'm still kind of having parts of my body like release tension. Feeling into that space that was behind me before. There's a lot of things coming up for me, which I'm sort of like holding outside of my field right now, because well, I'm just waiting for them to resolve into something which feels effortless and actionable, or non-actionable. Um, I guess I would say that like something that I've often said is that one's awareness is sort of like the basis of one's ability to shield. And then the next thing I'll say is that in one of the many conversations that I've had with Hoda in the room, we talked about like exchanging, I'll say, ancestral technology, which includes ancestors from the stars and ancestors from the earth. And related to like the root chakra, or like kind of just like having a skirt. And I kind of associate it with like an expanded root, like a flowing root, rather than say like a direct connection to the ground or through the earth star into the center of the earth. And then, I was like walking around the day we had that conversation, and I was like, oh, cool, like I got some leggings. And then I like offered them back to Huddersfield, and we kind of had a laugh about it. Kind of talked about like what those leggings or those skirts look like. And I would say that, like, going back to what I said about the awareness being like a canvas upon which one can say like paint like a shield, I think it occurs to me that I can offer that like one's awareness is a canvas for painting anything, right? Like not just like shielding, which is like a very martial archetype, let's say, but also like fancy or fun or frivolity. And so that portion of my field which was below and behind me at first sight sort of like assumed kind of like, I'd say like a baroque kind of skirt, right? I think most people pronounce it baroque, but yeah. um and it was sort of like a lavender color. And then I was reminded of a painting that you showed me, Maya, of like a, I mean, the painting that you showed me was of a little girl. So I was just moved to say just like a tutu, right? Or it was a painting that where you said that you don't often use glitter. So it was like somebody wearing a tutu, actually I think was pink and glittery, and like those are different textures of awareness which were able to appear in that part of my field. And then what came up was a peacock's tail. And then what came up was a gif of Michael Jackson saying he. Um, and
Yeah,
then
and
what's going
before you started talking, like I could feel like this weird black thing behind you, and then it just dissolved.
That's funny. I mean, all these all these like wisecracks are like popping up for me to talk about. But one of the things I like to say, like sarcastically or ironically, is like, "What do you think you are, psychic?" Because like people say that like sarcastically to people, at least in my experience. But I like to or have previously liked to say that when somebody is demonstrating what I would call like the ability to commune with spiritual energy in this context. And I don't know if you've noticed this about me, Maya, but I like to turn egregores upside down. I don't think that's going to stop, but I feel like it will change as a result of what's being purged now. And I guess what I was going to say before we like started speaking at the same time was just like I feel the blooming of, I'm going to call it what feels like a wattle, which is, are you familiar with that plant?
Not sure.
Sounds Australian to me, but it feels kind of like a pink, yellow, red wattle, the type which is like very sweet, I would say, and very appetizing to pollinators. And I would say that's rising out of my crown. And another thing that's coming up for me is there's a deity which I've associated with a star named Regal, named Nephtem in the constellation of Orion, which is known to be in some cosmologies like the child of Sekhmet, which I associate with the star system named Sirius. And in depictions of Nephtem, you see a man with a blue-green lotus appearing out of his crown. At least that's how I remember it. And I'm getting chills in my lower back as I say this, but what occurs to me is that this depiction was necessary for the time when those depictions were made. And blue and green sort of correlate to like the heart chakra correlates to green, I would say, in my lineages and many lineages, and indigo sort of correlates to like the third eye, and then like cyan or Kian sort of correlates to the throat. And the blossoming of like red, yellow, pink feels more like it correlates to like the root and the solar plexus. And like a really light or like sweet kind of emanation of root chakra energy. Ma sort of part of myself was like trying to look at the time, and then I just cleared it. Karuman anda korut erstedet korut sen betav kanemishte. Mandif de atprotenemishte amsuktim kam. Kam soroshan sakimishin. Kam soroman esteteram. Yet evan supam kimishte. Kokoram de beam shavim de Kim setemishte. Om enel puranda. Holy shit, I'm shouting. Yeah, solo katedra den mishate maskodian. Nyanishete mukunene kadeterishte peart. Kor shadamishen yesian fiamukodim. Nia shetim shoroten hiat yesim forum akam iasher. Mak yani amor de tedim nemofte. Kat ernik am sarakunimstum. So another thing that's coming up for me is like, like the chakra colors tend to go from red to orange to yellow to green to blue to indigo to violet, right? In the same order that they appear in like rainbows, or like the visible part of the electromagnetic spectrum. I just checked that nobody tried to join without me letting them in and clearing that too. But I guess what's coming up for me is like, what does it mean to like shift those chakra associations, let's say linearly, right? But I guess like it's kind of correlates to something that I've been working on independently, which is to like non-linearly allow those chakras to appear like rainbows in themselves. I feel like this has been coming up a little bit, maybe not in that exact formulation, but within this container that we call the broom right now. Which is not to say like the throat becomes like a root, because it'd be pretty funny if someone's throat were to become their pure name, right? But that the qualities that we might associate within this logos with the root might be embodied by the throat, let's say, which could be delineated by saying that we're more able to speak to our fears, or we're more able to speak to what we need to survive. And like if the root was to embody the archetypes of what we associate with the third eye or wisdom, then one might say that we could use our wisdom to work with our fears. Or our knowledge, I think, is probably falling in as a better word to use than wisdom.
Yeah, that caused a lot of tension in my root.
You say more?
It just felt like there was this crampy tension, but I guess it already released.
Mm-hmm.
Well, clearly not fully, but I mean,
I feel like for much of this container, I've been on this knife's edge of being like, well, like I talk a lot, but then there's like this knife's edge where on one side it's like, if I don't talk, then it's because of fear or shame or guilt or whatever, right? And then on the other side is just like, if I talk too much, it's because of, you could say fear or shame or guilt, obviously like different programs which attach to, I would say, like the disharmonies of those qualities of our energy. But the fact that I'm thinking about it all is part of what feels like it was attached to this like fighting for survival part in some texture, right? But the reason I said that, and it seems like so far I'm digressing about the same amount as I used to digress. um, the reason I said that is because what was coming up for me is, um, mm, there is like cosmology online about people of a place called Lemuria, which was named that because when it was first named Lemuria, I think it was by somebody who discovered that there were lemurs there. So whenever I talk about people of Mu, I find it kind of funny. And of course, in the part of Twitter that we call this part of Twitter somewhat obnoxiously, maybe, there's this thing called Lemagate happening right now. So it's making the cosmology that is referred to by the name of Lemuria seem even more comical. There are lemurs there, but I'd prefer to call it like Mu culture, let's say. And kind of what's coming up for me is something that I've said before, that I said today again, that my neuroses, and I think I've heard people say this in the material realm or write it down in text in the material realm, is that, like 9/10 of what we call Tantra now were channeled from the stars to earth by people of Mu. And then that 9/10 is only 30% of what people of Mu channeled and actually practiced in the time of Lemuria, the time we call Lemuria, which happened before the time that we call Atlantis. And I would say that, like, in various spaces, much of those realms still exist, right? Like, if we were to say that a realm is like a belief system, and I've heard like the time of Lemuria characterized as a time when people worked internally to access the divine, and the time of Atlantis is a time where people work externally to access the divine. And I feel like if you use those rather deconstructed definitions of the realm of Lemuria and the realm of Atlantis, then it becomes pretty obvious that those realms still exist in different spaces and in different moments where people choose to work internally to access divinity and externally to access divinity. And I feel like one example of the latter would be like eating, right? Sometimes we eat something and we're like, oh my gosh, this is divine. And you could say that we're just saying it, but the feeling that causes somebody to say that might be appreciated as a sense of divinity. And then you could say that in many moments, people find bliss in meditation. And in that moment, they are occupying what might be called derogatively, like a belief that they're accessing divinity. But I don't feel like it's any I don't feel like it's necessarily any less of a belief than the one that is accessed by somebody who's eating something which they attest tastes divine. But I would say that probably for most people on earth, sometimes we feel we have to access divinity internally, and sometimes we do. But then I would say, like, for me, sometimes perhaps that I feel that way in contexts where it would make sense for me to try to manifest divinity externally by, say, cleaning or something, or doing something which helps me to feel more safe financially or materially speaking. And vice versa, I feel like the more commonly criticized behavior in my experience is when people perhaps like seek divinity externally, let's say by eating something which makes them feel a certain way, rather than seeking divinity, not necessarily internally, but like intrinsically in every moment. And I'm curious how that lands for you, like.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't really have a lot to say to that, to be honest.
Can you say that again, please?
I don't have a lot to say to that, to be honest.
How do you feel about the presence of like parts or parts burdens in my field right now or outside of time? Or I'll say, compared to how you might feel in some contexts where we've talked about in the past, like the sense that there is like some kind of dark energy in my feeling.
Yeah, I mean, like when we started working today, there was just a lot of going on energetically, and there was like I was like wondering, like, okay, should I like narrate this stuff? Then I figure like, okay, if I'm going to narrate all this stuff that's happening, then there's no space for actual work. But yeah, there was so much stuff initially going on, and now there's very little stuff going on.
Yeah, it's interesting. I would say that like often, I guess I'll just speak on like this like thought form. I'll say demon, which relates to the idea that like, like spiritual practice means that we never suffer pain or suffering. And it's like, I'd say like often I'm guided or moved to do stuff which creates circumstances which allow me to touch things that previously I would hide from myself and experience. And I feel like people also say that that's sometimes cope, right? Like, oh, like things are bad in your life. Instead of practicing spirituality, you should get the latest video game or car or something like that. And I think that people perhaps resistant to spiritual practice might say that it's proof that spiritual practice is not worth doing. And then you have people who say that, yeah, like spiritual practice leads to a complete lack of pain or suffering. But what feels true for me in this moment is that pain's probably going to be around for a while. Like in our consensual reality. But it doesn't necessarily have to feel like suffering. And suffering may be around for a while, but I'll say, at least in my practice, it tends to show up only to point me towards things that can be released. And then I spend, again, like more time feeling increasingly joyful. And again, I'm curious like how that lands for you. Is I feel like both of us like are both positive about spiritual practice and critical of spiritual practice.
Yeah, and I guess for me, a lot of that relates to what what has been the theme for tonight, fighting for survival. It kind of feels like in a lot of ways, fighting for survival is excluded in spiritual communities.
Thank you for saying that. I don't mean thank you for saying that on my behalf. And I also don't mean to say that you're only saying on your behalf, but I feel like this is a topic which has increasingly come up in our conversations, like privately, which is related to a chapter in your book, which I haven't read a lot of yet, but I feel like I've been receiving in the realms of the unseen, which maybe not all of us believe is possible, but I feel in my gnosis, it's not only possible, but fairly commonplace, which relates to the topic of ableism and spirituality. And I feel grateful that not only have we talked about it, but that the practice of making offerings of terma, which we've talked about, has facilitated your offerings of terma relating to your experiences. And I would say my sense is the experience of many of like your sky ancestors and earth ancestors, or what some people call past lives, and just ancestors, regularly relating to experiences of hardship relating to scarcity and disability and scarcity induced by disability, which I feel like I've been able to like touch with my energetic body and then resolve. And I feel like what's arisen is a greater appreciation of not only the extent to which like several popular practices of spirituality have excluded disabled people, but even, and like this is like, I'm gonna like shield and ground the statement I'll make next, but like the extent to which scarcity and disability and scarcity induced by disability have been created and induced by spiritual praxis.
Yeah, and I guess it's really like there are two main ways to look at the whole fighting for survival. One is the lens of trauma, which is that almost all trauma is about having fought for survival in the past, and that's still imprinted in your body. And then the goal of healing the trauma is healing the parts that feel like you're fighting for survival, even if you're not. But then there are people who are actually fighting for survival in the current moment. And then if you try to look at that through the lens of trauma, it's usually called gaslighting, I feel.
Yeah, and I feel like you've spoken on this before, which is that like there are many spiritualists who kind of assume things like, which I think relates to what you're saying, that if you heal all your trauma, then you'll no longer have to fight for survival in some way. Just, you know, whether it's like with physical illness, chronic physical illness, even chronic mental illness, right? And then I think like the thing which I think gets a little more attention at times, which I feel like I look very much forward to exercising and dismembering this egregore, which is that like if you suffer from some kind of chronic or non-chronic intermittent disability, physical or metaphysical, aka mental, that like you deserve it because of karma. And I feel like this is one of the aforementioned disabling egregores or scarcity inducing egregores that is fairly pernicious and predominant in what I would call like distorted understandings of many spiritual lineages.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like in some ways my channel and perhaps like the channel of some of the people on this call right now, and maybe some of the people who might watch it, will probably be devoted to the exorcism of that group of thought form complexes. And I'm just waiting to see what arises. In you, or anybody in the container would like to say anything, if that's okay with you, Maya.
Yeah, I would definitely like to hear from the people here.
Okay, so it says all participants should be allowed to unmute themselves. Is that the case? I can't see what you can see on your screen, so anybody want to give me a thumbs down or a thumbs up if you can unmute yourself? Someone gave a thumbs up. Yeah, I can unmute. Okay. I'm gonna read out something that somebody said in the chat, because the chat doesn't necessarily end up in the recording. Rather than being about no longer fighting for survival, isn't healing trauma more about not having to continually feel like you're still fighting for survival against things that aren't still happening?
Yeah, I mean, that's the case if you are talking about past trauma, like childhood trauma. Then the body feels and the mind feels that they still have to fight for survival, which might no longer be the case. And I would also like to say that what I guided or what we did today, it was a mixture of different stuff, and a lot of it wasn't from any particular technique. But one of the most effective IFS techniques is telling parts your current age. And it's because a lot of parts are children and they might believe that you're still 5, even if they are angry at your boss, they might still believe that you're 5 years old. And then the world is very confusing for them. And if you let them know that, no, I'm actually a grown up and I can handle this, this can be super powerful. And of course, it's possible, like, I think this technique is only used in IFS, and obviously it's possible to heal trauma with tons of different techniques, but it's, yeah, all of them are basically based on updating your, yeah, this bad stuff happened, you were unsafe, and now you are actually safe. But then we go back to that situation, like, yeah, a lot of people aren't actually safe because of stuff like poverty, disability, medical abuse, racism, war, a lot of different things.
Yeah, I agree 100% with what you said. And I feel like the two things I would add is just like, again, like I feel like there can be some distance between like doing things for survival and like the feeling of like compulsion to doing them, which we might call fighting. But then I feel like it's very possible to actually like physically fight for survival without it feeling like fighting, right? And like now we're talking about like the inadequacy, or you could say like the contextual adequacy of words. But I feel like most of the people in this call or who we might watch this call probably have a sense of what I mean. And then the second thing I'll say, and I feel like I'll say digressing wildly again, so that is either not fixed or fixed, so it's only more appropriate or untouched, is that, you know, I kind of came into this knowing that like Maya is like a practitioner of IFS, and that a lot of people know about IFS through your work, even though in my opinion and based on my understanding and my gnosis, not enough people work with you based on how much you've done to popularize this work. I knew that you're an IFS practitioner, and you know, and many people know that I'm very critical of IFS, and I came into this call thinking like, I'm totally okay with like having no criticism of IFS after this call. Absolutely. Like I'm okay. I've given up my belief system so many times, and I've also eaten shit so many times that I would be totally ready to say like, after this call, that anything I ever said about IFS that was in any way critical or could have been interpreted as being critical, I renounce completely. But the one thing I'll say that still feels true, and maybe I need to be dismembered even further, is that I would not say that this technique exists only in IFS. And I would say that it feels true to me, and I'm curious if this feels true to other people, that IFS has in some ways unconsciously, and in some ways that may be intentional, taken up some of like the awareness relating to some of the shamanic influences that you mentioned before. And I'll say that like the technique of reminding parts like where one is in current time also exists in a lineage which I will ostentatiously say I was initiated in, and I'll less ostentatiously say I learned, called soul retrieval, which I believe, well, I learned it from a place called the Last Mask Center, which is a shamanic healing school. And I feel that, yeah, I'll say like gently that it doesn't feel appropriate to say that IFS is perhaps the only modality which uses that technique, but it does feel appropriative.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it would be pretty weird if no one had ever come up with it before. But as far as I'm aware, there are no Western therapy techniques, including there are a lot of techniques that use parts. And I will digress now and mention that like parts work and hypnosis is almost 100 years old thing. You don't need hypnosis for the stuff that we did, but it can help a little bit. But anyway, yeah, like there are many therapy schools using parts, and as far as I'm aware, they don't use this age updating thing, nor do like other common therapy techniques. Of course, it's possible that there are ones that I have missed, and it's who knows, like I wouldn't be surprised if this is like, yeah, maybe indigenous people all over the world have been aware of this for thousands of years, and in that case I apologize for this idea that IFS has invented this.
Apology accepted on behalf of my earth and sky ancestors, but I can't accept the apology on behalf of shamans and indigenous lineages which do not claim me. But I would love for that to be made more clear. What do you think about, I feel like we can find more common ground on this, right? Because like neither of us have trained in clinical psychology or anything that might be called like a master's of social work in America, which to me is ridiculous because to get one of, to get to become a licensed social worker in America, in a place which I would say needs a lot of social work, you're kind of looking at like an expensive tertiary education, aka like college or university or community college education, and then a very expensive licensing process, including clinical exposure for which you might not get paid. And I feel like it's standard for people to either accumulate massive loans or indebt themselves to mommy and daddy in order to license themselves to practice some of these modalities. And I'm curious, like, what do you feel like we can do to make it so that it's both more accessible for practitioners to be able to do this work and be sustained for it? And what do you feel like we can do to make it so that this work is more accessible to people who can't get free therapy from their insurance company or can't pay for it out of pocket, and who perhaps need it more than people who can?
Yeah, of course, this is a huge issue, and especially because people who are severely mentally ill, they are often not able to work, and they are often not able to access therapy. Yeah, so I think one of the main solutions that I've been proposing is that we need to make people more aware that something like self-therapy even exists, because like in the media, it doesn't exist. Most people have no idea. Of course, people know self-help books, but they are generally not very helpful for actual trauma or mental illness. And also therapy with your friends, and it may not be a substitute for therapy with a licensed professional, but it's certainly often better than like, oh, I can't ever do anything.
I'll say like my root chakra is just like partying right now to hear you say that. um, self-therapy, I think that it's partying. It's also like there's a little bit of a mosh pit in the middle because part of me recognizes that a lot of like self-therapy that's out there right now can actually be harmful, right? What do you think about that statement?
Yeah, there's a quote in my book which is I can't remember. It's from someone famous and well recognized who said something like he believed that therapy with your friends is actually safer than with a professional, because if you feel like it's not helping, you're going to get up and leave. While if you are with that professional therapist and you feel like, oh my God, this person is fucking me up, you might still think like, yeah, but what do I know? I'm just a poor client here, and this guy has trained for years, so I guess they know better.
Totally, or like I saved up for like a month to be able to have this session. So either unconsciously or consciously, or I don't really believe that those terms are used accurately, but I'd say like either under possession by demons or in a way which becomes self-aware, let's say, or unconsciously they might feel moved to stay in that session because they have worked so hard for the privilege of having somebody fucking listen to them, even if that person's fucking them. I think that what you said about therapy amongst friends resonates a lot for me. And when I say resonates a lot for me, I would say that there's a little bit of resonance, but it aligns a lot for me. It reminds me that many lineages talk about like Maitreya as being like the next Buddha to replace Shakyamuni. And some interpretations of what that means is like friendship, right? And I feel that it's not unfair to say that in many cultures we have outsourced to therapy and also given a lot of money to therapeutic industrial complexes because we don't know how to be good friends anymore. And I'm curious how you would respond to that question.
Yeah, I mean, we were already talking about shamanism, and of course, in shamanism, it's been a communal activity. Like it's like the idea in modern psychotherapy is that you can never work with your friends. Like if someone is your client, you're also never allowed to be their friend ever again. And this is such a like a weird idea that like there's a like if there's a village of 100 people and there's a shaman there and there's like, oh, I'm not allowed to have any friends because I work with all these people.
Totally.
It's a pretty messed up idea.
And then people say that like, therapists need therapists, and I think that's often true, right? Like in the most like popularly pronounced example of this is a show called Sopranos, right? Where the main person sees a therapist and then that therapist has a therapist. But I would say like it's deeply ironic that a lot of therapists don't even necessarily have friends that they can therapize with, even if it's just about unpacking the trauma that they've accumulated through poor energetic hygiene, in my opinion, in their work, which is often highly lucrative. There's one thing I want to come back to, but I guess like without interrupting what feels like a really laminar flow of conversation, I want to ask you what being a friend means to you.
We really don't have any easier questions for tonight. Like how we fix psychotherapy, what is friendship, and
I can ask the other question first, and I feel like it can still be very laminar. And maybe we can return to that question in another container. But first I'll say, recently on the timeline, I was called to name you as a friend. And that was surprising to me because a lot of our conversations are fucking difficult, let's be honest. But what I'll say for me in this context is like what moves me to call you a friend is that A, you show me things about myself that I can release to become what feels like a better person. And I deeply appreciate that about you. And then B, I'll say that when I reluctantly, you might be like, oh, you're like not that reluctant at all. But I would say in my field, it feels like I reluctantly point out things that I feel like could be ready to release for you. It might not always lead to the most pleasant conversation, but I feel like you earnestly work to become aware of the possibility that what I'm pointing at is in fact something that could be there, which is ready to be released. And I'll say you can still take the opportunity to describe what a friend is to you, but also that's what feels ripe for saying for me right now.
Yeah, and I appreciate you saying all that. And yeah, I guess it's for me, because I've had a lot of very difficult friends and very difficult friendships. And of course, a friendship being difficult doesn't necessarily translate it to being helpful or a good friendship. But I guess I'm very patient with like friendships that can be difficult and can be helpful and helpfully difficult. And I feel like a lot of people have an idea of friendship that's like basically the same idea that a lot of people have about spirituality, which is good vibes only, and the point of friends is to have a good time, and if you're not having a good time, then it's bye-bye.
I'm having a good time right now, but I completely agree with you. Like, you know, when you start saying this, like what came up for me, and I'll say it now. And I'll say like also that I'm very grateful for spiritual practice because I'm less likely to interrupt people. But when you started saying this, I was like, can we say this louder for the people who have like 2 or 3 million followers on Instagram who call themselves spiritualists, who like to me are basically anxious, avoidant, very charismatic, and in some cases physically attractive people. Um, and yeah, I think that that's a very important point, and I'm very glad that you named it. And I'm very glad that you named it the way you did, because I feel like the way that you name things is often very precise. And I've said this to you in our sessions, that and our conversations, that I feel like the way that you say things leaves impressions. And the fact that you're saying it now, and you know, you said it in the past too, and I feel like we should keep saying this, because if we listen to people who tell us that like whenever a relationship is difficult we need to run, and that like it's their problem not ours, then I think that we'll be relying a lot more on very highly paid therapists to continue telling us bullshit, and we will not be better people as a result of it. And then, yeah, if there's nothing else that you'd like to say about like what makes a good friend to you, I'll ask the question which was coming up for me earlier in the conversation around the need for mentally ill people to have accessible paths to like what I'll call like little T therapy, like actual healing. And I guess what's coming up for me is that like shamans often go through like what I call like initiations by spirit. They'll often hear voices, they'll often have visions. And I'll say, as concisely as I can, that many of these experiences are pathologized by the institutions which claim to be the arbitrators of what is good mental health, and which I feel are doing at least as much damage to mental health as they are doing to ameliorate mental health. And yeah, that wasn't very concise, but I'll wrap it up with a TLDR, which is like, what do you feel about the overlap between people who may be pathologized as mentally ill, who may believe themselves to be mentally ill on the one hand, and then people who may actually have the kinds of capacities which are very useful in little t, actual helpful, actually healing therapeutic settings?
Yeah, there was one study that I found super fascinating that I found when I was writing my book, which was about in the 1970s, there was this project where they were like having people with schizophrenia who were in mental institutions therapizing each other. And I was like, wow, this is so great. And this was like the 70s, and it would still be considered off limits now because people would be like, well, they are like psychotic and they are completely like messed up. How could they possibly help anyone? But it
And
turns out that they can.
yeah, and it might be like, oh, we should put them in isolation so that they don't poison each other with their psychoticness or whatever you might call it. When in fact that like A, that might cut off avenues to help, and B, it might actually like further the harm that has been done to these people, which you could say that many people who have what I would call shamanic capacities have already felt isolated by a society which pathologizes spiritual contact. And that's part of why their mental health is already either actually bad or looks bad by the standards of a society, which I would say is spiritually starved. Um, I'm just like meditating to see if there's anything that's coming up, but please, anybody feel free to unmute, and Maya, please feel free to keep talking.
Yeah, I will say one thing, one short thing, which is that, yeah, I also have a friend who has schizophrenia who has sometimes guided me IFS in the past. And that's like, yeah, I mean, why not? But I guess if a person with schizophrenia wants to be a therapist, and I'm pretty sure that such therapists do exist, but it's tricky. And it's tricky because most people wouldn't want to have a therapist with schizophrenia. It would be a taboo, and that's unfortunate.
I guess I'll say that in my experience, most people who are licensed social workers or licensed in some way to be deliverers or providers of mental health services have been very easily triggered, have gaslit me, have projected their own pathologies upon me, and in one case, unloaded on me with the vitriol, which I felt at the time and I still feel now, related to their anger at an ex-husband that they told me about, which ironically is probably some kind of violation of therapeutic best practices. And I'll say that many of the people I feel like that I've spoken to in some of the communities that you foster or garden in is like the term that I tend to use, have had very similar experiences. I'd say a lot of the people in communities that I garden in, like the Broom, have had pretty similar experiences. And I'd say that a lot of people in this part of Twitter or on Facebook or Instagram have probably had very similar experiences and serious experiences, but I don't feel like I see a lot of mentioned about those kinds of negative experiences with licensed mental health practitioners in the media and in social media.
And from the perspective of IFS and some other forms of psychotherapy, the main thing that the therapist, like their main goal is to not get triggered. And if they get triggered, they have to return to what IFS calls self, or we could just call like a ground of being or non-triggered state or presence or whatever. and yet like most therapists just fail, like what in IFS, for example, is step one. Like you cannot go to any other steps if you fail step one, yet these people practice therapy and then they get triggered when they hear, I mean, obviously therapists hear a lot of very triggering stuff and then they get triggered and it's like, no, you can't do that. And I've also had experiences with like friend therapists or shamanic friends or whatever you want to call them, who are very skilled and able in other ways, but they're the way that they get triggered all the time really hinders their ability to do anything and can even render them harmful.
Very well said. I'll say, like, not only so people can tell that I'm not just like in some kind of vendetta against licensed mental health practitioners, but also because I want to give a share or awareness to this, is that like the best licensed mental health experience I've had, which doesn't include this experience or many of the experiences I have with the broom, because many of these people are not licensed to give mental health advice or therapy, which is fucking bullshit. The best licensed mental health practice I've been a part of was with somebody I met on BetterHelp, who I had like maybe cumulatively 45 minutes of text conversation with, and then about half an hour of like live video practice with. And she was like, yeah, like it seems like you're in a pretty good spot. I'm gonna recommend to you a book by I think their name is Don Miguel Ruiz, and it was about Toltec wisdoms, Toltec translations of Toltec cosmology and Toltec understanding of what we would call mental health right now, but what they would call probably spiritual refinement or spiritual health. And then she was like, yeah, I don't feel like we need to keep talking. And I feel like that's in so many ways so polarized to probably, but definitely the mental health experiences I've had, and probably polarized to many mental health experiences that other people have, which are A, completely afraid of woo, B, very attached to making money off of their clients and turning them into long-term paid buddies. And yeah, I don't know what her last name is anymore, but Maria is dope. And I'm very grateful for that experience and for my exposure to a lineage that I'll call, without making weird sounds, just like Toltec spiritual health lineages. Four agreements sounds familiar, Colin. I don't know, four agreements. I don't know what that means, but I'm just gonna say like big ups to Maria and Toltec wisdom. It's 11 p.m. in Helsinki, I believe. Not to dox your location. It's definitely 11 p.m. in Sofia. I feel like this container has been super beneficial for me, and I feel like for many people who are part of this container, maybe you, I don't know. But I also feel like it will be beneficial for a lot of people who listen to any part of it, because I feel like energetic transmissions can occur outside the time. And yeah, I guess I'll say, if you want to say anything else before I close the container, if anybody else wants to say anything else, please have at it. Now you want to say goodbye? You don't want to big ups like your community. Mind is the Gap, which I feel like is a place that many people, many very special people, are doing really beautiful work for themselves and for the collective.
Yeah, yeah, sure. Yeah, I recommend my Discord community. Mind is the Gap. And yeah, I guess Discord links are a bit tricky, but you can get an invite from me or Nobu or Google it or something.
Thank
And
you.
also my book is lovingawakening.net, and it's free.
Yeah, and I look forward to reading about it and tweeting about it. And hopefully I feel like giving your work the attention that I feel it deserves, and also helping to connect people with working with you in ways which are not free, because I feel like you deserve to be paid for your work.
Thanks.
Yeah, if anybody wants to schedule work with Maya, I would recommend it. Okay, well, thanks y'all for showing up with your ancestors, and if you don't believe in ancestors, with whatever you showed up with. Thanks to you again, Maya. I look forward to having more conversations, both contentious and harmonious with you. And I'll see y'all in the material realm and on the internet, which is also in the material realm and in the immaterial realms. Good night. Peace.
Bye.